Hello and welcome to Serious Insights for Admins. I'm your host, Kristi Campbell, and I'm joined today by Riley Schill, the Principal Consultant at GoStratus. Hi, Riley.
Hey, Kristi.
I met Riley at Florida Dreamin' and Northeast Dreamin' and heard some great content he had around the education space and asked him if he would come in and talk to us about Education Cloud. And it's something I've never really dug into. So, Riley, how did you get started working with Salesforce Education Cloud?
Yeah, so I started in higher ed actually at the university I attended, Florida Polytechnic University, where I was the first class of students at a public state STEM university that just opened in 2014, and right out the door they used Salesforce. I started in admissions as a student worker my freshman year, just was that happy-go-lucky tour guide, but then as a data analyst in admissions.
I was a tour guide too.
Ah, I love that. So as a data entry person in admissions left for a logistics company, I had asked the vice provost of admissions there, hey, do you have someone to load those test scores into Salesforce? And that's how I sort of just snuck into doing data loads into Salesforce, where I was just SAT scores, ACT scores, name buys, and then that transitioned into getting my Salesforce admin certification my junior year, being brought on as a 32-hour-a-week OPS employee. Then right when I graduated, admissions hired me as a Salesforce admin. And then about a year in the admissions office, IT hired me as a Salesforce developer. So
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So you just were a user and then just loved it and then have just not known anything else. I love it. You mentioned test scores and some other kind of pieces. I think the general business use case around Salesforce and Sales Cloud is, pretty known and straightforward. But what are the basic problems, especially now that you're working with multiple universities as a consultant? What are the basic problems that universities are using Salesforce to try and solve?
So they're really using it to just see a 360 view of the student. That is something that Salesforce really pushes on any education session because universities are so fragmented in the software that they use, and a lot of it is just legacy software that probably should have died a long time ago. In my specific case with Florida Poly was CAMS, where the only browser you could use to get into the SIS was Internet Explorer. Not even Edge. It had to be Internet Explorer to open it. So it's when you have systems like that that then can't talk to something like Canvas that it just starts to become harder to maintain than it's worth. And then your IT department is split between the registrar's office and admissions and all the other departments that have their very specific software that IT has to maintain and has to hire the staff to maintain. So that's where Salesforce kind of comes in to get everyone working in the same system, centralize the IT resources around it, and then all of the data is at least in the same system. It doesn't have to be shared at that point because some departments get picky about who gets to see their data, but at least it's in the same system and automation can be built around it, and you can you can share it easier if the departments are willing to work together.
So can you help? So the student is essentially the customer, and we're tracking maybe all the way through like when they're applying as a quote unquote lead kind of until they get accepted and maybe get some financial aid. And then you mentioned kind of stuff from the application that you're storing. And then it sounds like maybe, is this all the way through to like class schedules and grades and maybe class reviews and like all, and then toward graduate all the way through to graduation, and maybe alumni pieces too?
Yeah, so alumni is a big part of that at the end, but it is for the full life cycle of a student is a contact where they can have multiple applications. They can apply for multiple programs if, say, they're a graduate student versus a traditional student that can only apply to one, basically a term. They apply to be in that class, whereas a graduate student has to apply to a specific college of engineering. And then with that, you have the full student life cycle for that 4 years. And then if they want to attend, if it's an undergrad that wants to attend their graduate program, then that would be a second enrollment record on their contact. Then once they graduate, you have the ability to hand that off to the advancement department because that student is now a potential donor. But you don't want to separate the fact that just because they're a potential donor, they could leave for 5 years and come back for a master's degree then. So everyone's sharing the same record. Advancement can see when that student came back. But then that's if you're using admissions and the advancement side. The piece that is in the middle is all of the course scheduling that is not used as frequently in higher ed where it should be. So in the education data architecture data model, the big piece that they provide is the objects for courses, course connections, terms, term grades, course offering schedules, time blocks, facilities, terms, program plans, plan requirements, program enrollments. That's the core of the course side of it. But they provide that all out of the box with EDA.
Gotcha. Okay, so the education data architecture, or EDA, is like a managed package that's bringing you all of the, or, like a layer on top of your cloud, right? That's bringing you all of those objects so you don't have to build them out, essentially.
Correct.
Okay. And even, I think getting into, Student Hubs is my equivalent of like Experience Cloud, or is it a similar flavor? So you're essentially, your students are your users that are coming into your community to do stuff?
Yeah, so the community is a big component of making it easy for students to both engage with other students and, say, be in a group for their course, but also once they're authenticated in the community, it makes it so much easier to say, hey, you have to fill out this form to apply for graduation, and here's the link to do it. And that link can just be something as simple as a screen flow because you already know who the student is because they're logged in. You don't have to ask them to go download this form from their website, fill it out, email it to the registrar's office. You can have it all automated and submit a case for the registrar right there.
Print it, sign it, fax it. Yeah, I like it.
Yeah.
And so there's also tradition. You mentioned email, right? So I'm assuming you can also still use Marketing Cloud, whatever they call Pardot now, Service Cloud, if you have, people who are having issues, like that kind of stuff as well.
Yeah, definitely. So, most schools that I work with, use Pardot pretty heavily. It is, while a great tool, it's a little challenging sometimes with making it work for the higher ed use case, but Marketing Cloud also works with the EDA data architecture. Well, as we know, Marketing Cloud is much harder to maintain than Pardot. And then Service Cloud is, not only does it work with EDA, but EDA sits on top of either Sales or Service Cloud, but I would definitely recommend Service Cloud because with the higher ed nonprofit pricing, higher eds can receive the Service Cloud licenses for the same exact price as Sales Cloud. And while there's some debate on losing stuff with Service Cloud, if you don't have any Service Cloud licenses, I have not seen that in the slightest. So I have a university that next to Service Cloud licenses says NA or 0, or sorry, next to Sales Cloud licenses says 0, but they still have access to quotes, sales contracts, opportunity splits, pipeline inspection, territory management. They have everything Sales Cloud provides, but they have 0 Sales Cloud licenses. So Service Cloud is definitely the way to go for the same price.
Interesting. Okay, so then we talked a little bit about the EDA structure. So are there any kind of special things like that, you know, I as a, let's say a standard admin, you know, may not be as familiar with in terms of kind of the objects or structure, aside from, you know, these new, you're giving me all these great custom objects that have relationships, and probably some calculations with them, but any other kind of special stuff?
Yeah, definitely. So apart from all of the course and program objects, there are some objects that are they are shared between the Education Data Architecture and NPSP Nonprofit Success Pack, where they use affiliations and relationships. So an affiliation is a lookup to the account object from the contact, and in EDA, you have multiple account record types. So you can have an administrative, of the record types, you have administrative account, which is just a single person. You can have a university department, a academic institution, an academic program. You have all of these options for affiliations, and then with that affiliation junction object, you can say, okay, this contact is affiliated with this academic institution, which was their high school, and you have a start and end date on that affiliation, but then they're affiliated with this academic program, and you only have a start date on that because they're currently in the program. So from that central affiliation object and related list, you can see at a high level, this is the stuff that the student was affiliated with in the past. These are the current affiliations, and you get a really nice overview, all using just contacts and accounts.
So almost kind of like campaign members, sort of. That I can be associated to multiples with different contacts. Okay.
Definitely.
I like it.
And then the other part of that is just relationships. So that's a contact to contact lookup junction object. So a relationship will just say, I, as a contact, have a relationship to this other contact, and the relationship type is defined as whatever you want it to be, but it would be, say, this is my mother. And that would be used for donor tracking because you want to know who the student's parents are to contact them too. Or you would use it for, this is the contact's academic advisor. So you can see at a high level, this is the student, and these are all of the people internally and externally they are related to and what that relationship is.
So interesting, because I can see how easily it gets complex, right? And like you mentioned, especially if all those systems have, like, I'm just thinking even for like thinking of the life cycle of one student, right? And your point is valid of, you know, tying to my high school and tying to my parents, but then like, that's tying to programs. But as you mentioned, you could have multiple programs. You could have potentially a group of universities, I think, probably using the same instance, right? If they have different locations, right? So, and then you've just like, it exponentially just gets really, really interesting because we're nerds, and instead of confusing, we'll say interesting. And tracking that all the way back to high school is really interesting, but it makes sense because with your application, right, you've got transcripts, you've got test scores, you've got things that relate back. So seeing that whole life cycle, the advisor piece is really interesting too. Maybe I need to get into this. Okay, so if a university is using Salesforce, are they definitely using EDA?
Not 100% of the time. I would say as time has gone on, I would be surprised to see anyone not. The only case would be if someone has been in Salesforce for a while. They're probably still in Classic 2, and they just haven't been willing to or had the resources to switch to EDA.
Okay. And do you typically see that universities, you kind of mentioned they might not be using part of it, right? So is it like chunks that I can use, or you just get the whole thing and then you can decide which chunks you want to leverage?
So you get the whole thing.
Okay.
So you do get the whole thing, but you can just decide what objects you want to use or not. And then from the EDA settings, you can disable the backend automation that will do things like automatically create backwards relationships. So if I created a relationship saying that this contact is my mother, then EDA would create a relationship on my mom's record to say I am her son. So it creates the reverse of that automatically.
Okay. So then I could just use this for admissions, or I could just use this for course tracking or for the alumni department if I wanted to. But then that could certainly, like, you've got the baseline of students, right? So then just like someone using Sales Cloud and adding Service Cloud, right, that you could, evolve and add more and more functionality.
Definitely. It's just, you can pick and choose which departments you bring on, but they have the foundation to bring in more data, and data is the biggest key to that. Is if you're the admissions department but you can get course data in there, then all of your admissions counselors are empowered to be able to quickly look up a course and talk about it when they're on the phone with a student and say, this is everything I know about this course, without having to leave the system.
Interesting. And you mentioned data. When we were prepping for this, I thought this was really interesting, the idea of the auto archive date and kind of how that uniquely applies to universities. You want to talk a little bit about how the data adds up?
Yeah. So a big activities are used very extensively in higher ed, just because you want to track every communication with the student. And one of the benefits is that if the financial aid office is emailing a student, they can go to the contact record and see, oh, this student has been emailing back and forth with the registrar about their financial aid issues the last week nonstop. So I want to see that. So activities are so useful just to see which departments are currently communicating with the student and what they've been talking about. But then for the auto archive date, Salesforce has a default to automatically archive activities that are older than a year. And what that means is that they just can't be reported on. And if you go to the record, it's not going to automatically show it. You have to go in and click down on show more. But the reporting is the big piece that you lose, because you want to be able to say, this department handles this many, this department communicates to students about this subject this many times. But if you lose that year to year, you're crippling yourself when a student's typical life cycle is 4 years. But Salesforce does let you extend the auto archive date. They recommend a maximum of 5 years plus 1 leap day, which they specify, oddly enough. But the maximum is 10 years. However, they don't want you to go over the 5 years because it will just make it will really just be for reporting, from what I understand, but reporting on activities would be a lot slower if you went over that 5-year auto archive date.
Interesting. It's interesting to think about, like the default structure is 4 years, right? Hypothetically. So it's just interesting to think about how that varies from the typical kind of, business use case, which is why I think it's great they've built this up and continue to build up, to support the needs specific to universities and education cloud in general, right? Because it's not necessarily just universities, I think.
Yeah, no, they want to be inclusive, K through 12 pretty much. They are trying to target that entire market.
Interesting. Tracking your kindergartner all the way through. I love it. So,
yeah.
So you obviously came into this, as a user from a university. If someone was interested, is maybe deciding to make a career change, is interested in this industry and wants to get into Salesforce, can you tell me, are there unique kind of roles for managing the education cloud side for Salesforce aside from your typical, BA, technical architect, those kinds of roles?
I would say, at least in my world, I see, other than obviously Salesforce admins and developers, business analysts are very common because you have to have someone that really understands the university process, which can be very, very complicated. And departments have stuff that has been happening for 15 years and can't change and has to happen in that order. So when you're implementing in Salesforce, you have to have a business analyst to understand that. But other than that, I would say the difference would be whether you work for a specific department or central IT. Both have their pros and cons. IT has more of a structured process where you have to absolutely do everything in a sandbox first, and you have to submit it for review to that department and have them test it and go back. Whereas if you work for the department, you have more flexibility of, if it's something small, if you're just updating a page layout, you don't have to go through the deployment process for every little thing. Not that that's a bad thing, it's just a difference. There's more structure in central IT.
Well, and there's some, consistency potentially, as opposed to every department kind of running their own thing, but you're sharing an instance. So, depending on, like you say, the more you do with it, having more admins and potentially the balance of having that IT background, that's interesting. Again, similar to other large companies. I like it. So, if I am a nerd that wants to learn more about this, or like I say, jump into it, whether I've got experience or not, how would you recommend people kind of get experience with the EDA and the kind of unique needs there?
Yeah, so I would say the obvious answer that is Trailhead. Searching for just the education data architecture modules is the best place to start to see if you're interested in it in the first place. And then past that, if you just search for education data architecture workbook or data model, you'll see the top links are just the ERD. They have a great PDF that will be linked in the show notes that is just an overview of what each object is and what data it expects. And then to become more involved, there are Salesforce hosts open source community sprints. And those are just projects where people gather together to work on a certain problem and volunteer their time. And two of the open source community sprint projects are central or higher ed centralized, give or take, which is transfer equivalency, where it's articulating transfer credits to from other universities and have a standardized database to say, okay, this student transferred in credits from 2 years ago, and now this new student wants to. We know that they already transfer, and that's a project that I co-lead with Kathy Lukeman. Have a fun time there. And then Summit Events is was started as a university project to have a open source event solution where students can say register for a tour. And it's a really great tool, but both projects can constantly use more volunteers, and that's a good way to sort of just meet people in the higher ed space. And then past that is the education hub in the Trailblazer community that is just the daily posts of everything and anything Salesforce and education.
I like it. I think the sprints are really interesting because it's really like for the community by the community, right? It's things that people have come up with, requirements that they want and need, and the things that enough people need kind of bottle up and are getting worked on by wonderful people in their spare time, as you mentioned, and then kind of those things can become available and become part of the piece, similar to like Salesforce Labs, right? Where you've got Salesforce employees that are building stuff because they're wonderful nerds, but it's not part of the product, but to be able to make it available to other people. I really like that idea of getting involved with like this niche of the Ohana, right? We know that, when you're learning, there's all kinds of people out there, user groups, etc., that are available to help and support you. But to get into this niche and working with other higher ed people, I think is great.
Yeah. And I actually,
go ahead.
I was going to say that Salesforce employees very frequently join the open source sprints. So like 2 years ago, I worked with Matt Blansky, who is on the education data architecture team internally at Salesforce, and he joined our transfer credit group and helped us out on that project for 2 days. So it was nice to see the internal view of EDA and talk to him about how we make this open source solution work as well as it can with EDA out of the box.
That's awesome. And you had mentioned too the so some universities are not for profit, right? So that ties into the free licenses. Did you want to touch on? In case people
yeah, definitely. So one huge program that Salesforce offers for higher eds and nonprofits is the Power of Us 10 program. So they will give you 10 free enterprise licenses for life. You just have to submit your nonprofit. You have to just submit a form that shows that you are a legal nonprofit, and you get a full-on Salesforce instance for free. No strings, no credit card required.
I love it. I think it's really a key part of course, their 1-1-1 business model, but that it's enterprise licenses. It's not that they're giving you like the cheapest ones, that it's a higher tier license to really support things like this. And like you said, moving the technology forward and getting the things integrated, systems integrated, and really kind of helping get out of those, get you out of Internet Explorer. So yeah. I love it. Thank you so much, Riley. This has been a great look at Education Cloud. Before we go, I did want to check in on the Ad Minute, something you thought that other admins might enjoy reading or listening to that's caught your eye recently.
Yeah, definitely. So when you had asked me what I watched recently, I was definitely most excited seeing a video posted on the Salesforce admins YouTube page where they, in 20 minutes, walked through how to set up SSO into sandboxes. So from your production instance, you could just go to the app launcher, search for your sandbox name, and click on it and be logged directly into that sandbox. And that's not just for you, but that is for every single user in your org. So if you have a testing sandbox, you can just say, hey, everyone, go click this, and everyone can go into your sandbox and test it.
I loved it because it's Jen Lee as hosting, and then Gaurav Seth came up with the solution. Not only would it help you not have to reset your users' passwords and test.salesforce.com and the whole shebang that we know is annoying trying to get users into a sandbox, but I think as an admin, it's really good tips for like learning how Connected App works and learning more about SSO and kind of how that structure works. So I agree. Definitely a good one to check out. I'm excited by the new Salesforce Architects team. They're starting a new series launched at TDX of Salesforce Well Architected. And so I'll link to the first post, but which is by Zane Turner on that team. And so they are just releasing content around streamlining and, you know, making sure that you think like an architect and are well architecting your Salesforce, which they're then applying to their own architect.salesforce.com site where they post a lot of their content. So I thought that was great to see. And that's kind of, I'm technically an architect, but I don't fully appreciate that about myself vibe going on. So that was a great series that they started there. So awesome. Well, thank you so much, Riley, for helping me, at least, I hope everyone else, better understand Education Cloud, not Higher Ed Cloud, and the education data architecture.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.